This is a presentation of OneLogin training.
Welcome to installing and configuring the Active Directory connector, part 3. All right, so now that we have all of our users synced, let's talk a bit about how that sync process actually works once it's been all set up. So there are 3 main types of user syncs. That initial user import, again, you can trigger it manually if you wish from that actions menu as we just saw. And the real-time sync that I mentioned, that will kick in once I've set this guy up such that anytime a user is created or changed within Active Directory, that change will be pushed to OneLogin. There is also a periodically sort of full directory sync, and it's used to basically kind of catch certain types of changes. For example, when users are added to a group, not when groups are added to the user. And I'll talk a little bit about that distinction in a few minutes here. So first, again, the initial user import, we already looked at this one. That's underneath that More Actions menu. Choose Synchronize Users. That'll catch everybody. That's sort of you manually doing a full sync there. And then the real-time sync. Again, triggered anytime a user is created, anytime one of their attributes has been updated, user is deleted, and or if a user has been moved, say from one OU to another. Okay? Those will all trigger real-time syncs. OneLogin should be updated immediately. However, again, there are certain types of changes that the real-time sync might miss. So, if that Active Directory connector service is not running, stopped, restarting, maybe it's in the process of automatically failing over, and a user happens to be changed, updated, or deleted during those times, then guess what? No real-time sync. Well, that makes sense. It wasn't quite paying attention. It was busy doing some other things. So what we have done is we have set up every 15 minutes, a full directory sync occurs. Now, it doesn't automatically resync everything. It goes for like a little change. We'll talk, creates a hash, figures out whether a change actually has been made to the record and syncs the records that actually changed. But it's going to go through the directory to see all the changes and sync them at that point in time. Okay, so basically, what'd I miss? I was asleep for a little while. What'd I miss? Also, there's a slight difference between a user record being changed versus a group record being changed. So the Active Directory connector service is really listening for user events. So user record, I go to the user record in Active Directory, users and computers, and I add that user to a group by going to their member of tab and adding a group to the member of tab. That's a user event. Okay, that will trigger a real-time sync. However, if I go about it a different direction, if I go to a group object within Active Directory and I go add users as members of that group, that's not triggering necessarily a user event. It's a group event. So the Active Directory connector service doesn't actually respond to those. So if changes were made in that order, you modified the group technically, not the user object. I understand it's still modifying the user object underneath, but it's just the way the events are firing off. Then, again, real-time sync the full directory sync, that periodic full directory sync will catch those types of changes and make sure that, again, if the user was added to the group via the group object, we will know that within OneLogin. And if OUs were renamed, deleted, etc., again, those are changes to the OUs. Those are not captured by that Active Directory connector service. Thus, full directory sync will be able to capture those changes. You can wait 15 minutes, or you could simply restart the service. That also triggers that full directory sync. And again, it's not that it's necessarily replicating everything over. Again, it's got basically a hash, keeping track of the records in the Active Directory side versus the OneLogin side. The hash value for the user record is different. It knows that that record is different. Therefore, it will update that particular user record. So it doesn't have to go through. It's called a full directory sync, but it's not like it's pulling every single Active Directory record over again. It really does look for the changes. Okay. Now that we covered the basics of setting up a sync between OneLogin and Active Directory, let's take a look at one of the great benefits of using OneLogin, the ability for Active Directory users to reset their passwords in Active Directory through OneLogin. Basic reset password process looks like this. A user initiates a password reset. Maybe they forgot their password, they need to reset their password because it expired, or they simply want to go to their profile in OneLogin and choose to reset their password from there. All of these actions will initiate a password reset. OneLogin confirms that the request is coming from the actual user via an approved authentication factor, such as an email or using OneLogin Protect. This step is unnecessary if a user is just changing their password through their profile. A reset token is generated and the user specifies a new password. The token is used to update the password through OneLogin. Then the new password is pushed all the way through to the Active Directory domain controller via the Active Directory connector. This password reset functionality is enabled by default. If you don't want Active Directory users to be able to reset their passwords, also known as self-service password reset, through OneLogin, you can disable this process on the Account Recovery tab of the user policy that applies to the users. Just clear that first checkbox there. Allow users to update their directory password. To control what options they have to confirm the request is coming from them, you can choose from a list of available authentication factors under the Select Factors Available. What options are listed there will depend upon what authentication factors you've enabled for your OneLogin account. Several of these options require users to register the factor ahead of time in order to use it, like OneLogin Protect. So make sure they're set up appropriately with the correct factors. The other options on this tab aren't necessarily related to resetting passwords just in AD. So the allow users to unlock their accounts just means they can unlock their accounts in OneLogin if they're able to authenticate with one of the selected auth factors. How this affects their locked or unlocked status in Active Directory depends upon the direction of the sync. Is it only from AD to OneLogin, or is it bidirectional? And depends upon that do not write user status back to Active Directory setting. That's over at the bottom of the Advanced tab for the Active Directory connector. We looked at it just a little while ago. The Require CAPTCHA option also doesn't have anything specifically to do with resetting passwords in AD. It just says whether or not a user has to basically complete a reCAPTCHA kind of task before they can reset their password through OneLogin. Now let's take a look at how to configure the Active Directory connector for load balancing and high availability. So far, we've only installed the Active Directory connector on one server within our AD environment. This means that if something goes wrong with that system and the ADC service is no longer available, then our users will not be able to log into OneLogin with their AD credentials, nor will their user account changes be synced between Active Directory and OneLogin. So, the best thing to do is to install the Active Directory connector on more than one member server in the AD environment. We refer to each of these installations as ADC instances. When you have more than one instance of the ADC installed, Users can be authenticated by any one of the running instances. However, only one instance is actively syncing changes between Active Directory and OneLogin. Thus, the authentication process is load balanced between the instances, but the sync process is dependent upon you enabling that auto sync failover option, remember on the advanced tab for the Active Directory connector, and that will ensure that if that, again, one server that's handling the sync goes down, its job will automatically be failed over to another available instance. So, how do you add a new ADC instance? Well, it's pretty simple. First, make sure you have a server that is a member of the same AD environment available to install the software on. Then, from the Connector Instances tab for the ADC connected to that environment, click on the plus sign in that upper right-hand corner. Type some sort of brilliant name so you know maybe where it's being installed. Then click on the new connector that you just added. From there, you can download the software and install it on that new member server. When you're done, click Continue, and you should see it show as connected within a couple of minutes. Notice that first instance, the one that we here called just ADC, has check marks under both the user sync and auth columns. It is currently the primary ADC instance and is handling all syncs between Active Directory and OneLogin. The new instance, however, will handle the part of authentication requests that are coming in. Again, then those auth requests will automatically be load balanced between ADC and what we called ADC 2, the new instance. If you need to manually fail over from one ADC instance to another, for example, you might need to do some sort of upgrade to a new version of the Active Directory software, then you can manually promote another Active Directory connector instance to handle that sync process. This is done from the same connector instance tab of that Active Directory connector. Just click the one you want to promote, in this case, ADC 2, and toggle the user synchronization green. Warning pops up telling you that the current primary, the one currently handling the syncs, no longer going to be able to handle those syncs, and all you have to do is really just click Continue. Now you're back to the Connector Instances tab, and we can see there's now a checkbox for ADC 2 underneath User Sync and Auth, and ADC is just handling authentication. So again, remember that Enable Auto Switch Sync Failover, that one over on the Advanced tab of our Active Directory connector? Well, if that is checked, then the job of syncing users from one AD to OneLogin will automatically fail over to another ADC instance. Again, if that primary ADC instance goes down. But the automatic failover only works if you checked the Enable Auto Switch Sync Failover. If you haven't checked this checkbox, then you would have to manually promote one of those other connector instances, as we looked at in the previous slide. So let's add an instance to our demo environment. So now we're on another server within our Active Directory environment. It's brilliantly named Member, if you look in the upper right-hand corner. And again, we're going to be adding an Active Directory connector instance to the Active Directory connector we've already added to this environment, which we will find over here. Here's the Active Directory connector. And we can see currently we have a single instance, again, brilliantly named ADC. So now we're going to add in a new Active Directory connector instance. Click on Add Active AD Connector Instance. Give it a brand new name like ADC 2. And Click Save. So once it pops up here, now we can select it and download software. Now, the new software, we'll install it just like we did the software for the first instance. We're going to click Next, accept the terms, Next. We need the installation token. We're going to copy it from Properties there, paste it into the wizard, click Next. We're going to use the same service account we've already created. Hope we did not fat finger. There we go. Click Next and install. That's about it. We're just creating another instance. So gave us a little warning. That's fine. We're going to click OK. And the service starts up. Click Finish. Continue over here, and voila, we have brand new instance here. It has communicated. We can see our versions are up to date. We can see the status over there. They're both connected. Ta-da! Some of you might be wondering what to do if you have more than one Active Directory forest. Well, there are basically two options. You can add an Active Directory connector to your OneLogin account for each forest, or you can set up a forest trust between the forest you already have connected via the Active Directory connector in OneLogin and whatever other forest or forests that you have out there, and then sync all your users through the single Active Directory connector you initially created. This would also mean that you need to give that Active Directory connector service account manage user type permissions within the other forests. So again, for each forest, if you want multiple forests and an Active Directory for each forest, so configure and sync them separately, you will need to have multiple instances of the Active Directory connector installed into each forest, right? So single Active Directory connector that we are adding to OneLogin, and then we install and configure multiple instances per Active Directory connector into each forest. So again, we have load balancing and failover functionality for that service within each of the forests. So that literally means that for each forest, you need to go users menu, directory, click the new directory button, choose Active Directory, and run that Active Directory setup wizard once, right? That's what we did to set up the Active Directory connector in the single forest, single domain that we demoed earlier. You would have to run through that for each forest if you want to manage a separate Active Directory connector for each forest. So go through, click Choose, and run that Active Directory setup wizard. That installs the first instance of the Active Directory connector within the forest, and then you will add new instances, as we just talked about, to additional member servers within those forests. And again, if you want the other option, all of the configuration would really have to be done on the Microsoft side. Setting up that two-way forest trust, that's a Microsoft configuration done through Forest and Trust. And then again, you would have to give that Active Directory connector service account in your primary forest, the one you initially connected to. You have to give it basically those manage user privileges that we talked about within the other forests. So like the ability to create user accounts or just update user accounts or reset their passwords, that kind of delegate admin stuff you need to do for that service account within the other forests if you want all the syncing to go through a single Active Directory connector that is connected to one of those forests. Now, for our final topic, we're going to take a look at some of our Active Directory connector troubleshooting kind of tips and tricks here. So, first and foremost, as with most troubleshooting in the Microsoft world, a quick restart of the service will often cure all that ails ya. So, you can do this through the service's MMC, as we see here. Again, I'm just restarting that OneLogin Active Directory connector service. Or of course, you could do it through PowerShell, whatever you choose. And remember, there are a few times where you need to restart that Active Directory connector service. We already noted them. For example, when you change config files, like when you use that domain config wizard, or if you make changes to your OUs, create new OUs, move OUs around, things along those lines, those will necessitate a restart of the Active Directory connector services so that basically it kind of knows about the new OUs and the users in them and such. And don't forget to make that change to that ADC service so it starts automatically with a delay, because those dependencies, some admins find that it does not come back automatically when their servers had to be rebooted. So setting it to the delayed start will fix that problem. So you can go again to the services MMC and just modify the properties of the OneLogin Active Directory connector service account. There are actually some log files you can browse to on your ADC instances. Sometimes they'll give you a hint as to what might be going wrong. So you'll find them underneath program data, OneLogin. They are hidden. So make sure that you change those view settings so you can view the hidden items ahead of time. And last bit here to note is that communication between the Active Directory connector instances and OneLogin is dependent upon an API key. And the ADC service uses this key basically to authenticate into OneLogin. If your systems have been compromised, it's a good idea to reset the key. You can do this under the developers menu, API credentials, then click on View Legacy API Key. If you do so, you will see something that looks like this form. And so you can click on Generate New API Key. If you do this, then that token will change. So you'll have to go over and grab new token from your ADC instances and then run through basically the ADC setup again to specify the new token. Okay, so not something you want to do every day, but if there is some sort of compromise to those systems, you need to make sure that that key is not being used to just access OneLogin willy-nilly. So you might need to regenerate the key and then again specify a new token over on the Active Directory connector instance side. This concludes installing and configuring the Active Directory connector.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.